We're going to talk about consent. What does that mean, indeed? And we've got 4 great panelists and a helper. Amy has got Ava as a helper, and Ava actually came along with her own name. You like just 2 A's together, didn't you, Ava? Yeah. So would you introduce yourselves one by one, and just briefly what you do, and then we're going to get down to the talking.
Hello, I'm Dr Amy Kavanagh. I am a disability activist, I'm blind, and hopefully Ava will kind of mainly do this, but if I get kind of activated emotionally, she'll pop up and probably give me a little cuddle. So I talk all about issues around disability and sexual violence.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sangeeta Pillai. I'm the founder of a network called Sutras. It's all about taboos in South Asian culture, talk about sex and sexuality and periods and all the things we're not supposed to talk about. I'm also the creator of Masala podcast.
And wearing this fantastic necklace, which is
Beisharam, which is shameless in Hindi.
Excellent.
I'm Tanaka Mhishi. I do far too many things, most of which have to do with supporting conversations around consent, with a particular but not exclusive focus on male survivors of sexual violence. So I'm a trustee for Survivors UK. I write plays, I write poems. I'm generally here, there, and everywhere.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, I'm Jacqueline Rose. I teach and I write. I'm based at Birkbeck, at the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities.
So 4 fantastic people here. I did a session actually on consent in the summer at the Prima Donna Festival in Sussex and Suffolk. And just before that, I read a book called Rough about kind of contemporary relationships to sex. And I was re-educated about some of the things which we now have subsumed into society as things you ought to consent to, whether you do or don't want to. Strangling, spitting, all kinds of things which, in my day, as they say, would have been outside a boundary that I would have had to deal with. But that's not to say that in my day, as a teenager, I didn't have my own version of just assuming that things that were done to me were by my consent, even though I didn't really know what they were or how I would have said no anyway. And, so much of being a good girl is both not doing things, but at the same time doing what you're told. And that confusion about how do I be good on all grounds to everything that's being asked of me is something that I think creates this huge sense of confusion around consent internally to us as well as externally to others. And of course, you're groomed to be good and you're groomed to be compliant, and even people who love you want you to be a good person, a good girl, and then people who think they love you in certain kinds of ways also want you to be compliant. So there's a tremendous, I would say, a huge internal confusion. And speaking for myself, since I just want to say this, recounting something that happened to me when I was 16, I gave consent to lose my virginity because there wasn't really any choice. And then I gave consent again to have sex because otherwise the alternative was violence. On both counts, I thought I'd given consent. It only ever much, much later in my life, looking back on it, thought that was a child who had no option and therefore said yes because the alternative was worse. And nobody, I think, and somebody once said to me, why aren't you more angry? And of course I realized that I'd gone straight to that relativism that so many women inhabit, and men who are victims and survivors as well, which is, well, it could have been worse. And, and almost like I should be grateful that it wasn't worse, and therefore I'm going to kind of minimize it. And this whole territory of consent seems to me to have been constructed as much within ourselves as externally now. And we maintain it very, very well. And now, increasingly, we are saying, just hold on 1 second. And I speak specifically about also my generation of women, because when the Me Too movement sprang up, if you remember, there were quite a lot of older women who kind of went, well, didn't do me any harm. Well, that's a big question. I would say it did do everybody harm, but you minimize the harm and you pass it forward. And the whole idea of saying zero tolerance has never been available around the whole idea of sexual violence and sexual consent. It's never been available, zero tolerance to these things, because we've never believed that we were equal, and we've never seen a world where we could demonstrate that we have been. And so the act of imagination and sort of confidence it takes to insist that your version of consent is going to be very different, it's a big ask when you've been trained to be a good person, a good girl. I mean, so that's just a sort of starting point that I wanted to give on reflecting on this idea of consent and why it's so troublesome for people, and how our own desire as women is to protect men because we love them or are told to protect them, and so we always try to get them out of a difficult situation, even if it's of their making and on us. Jacqueline, can I come to you? Right, this consent, it's like a simple word. And, what do we do with it? Because when you unpack it, it just goes, like a slinky going down the stairs.
I love your metaphors, by the way, your similes. Well, I want to say a couple of things which might sound a bit contradictory, but I want to start by saying this couldn't be more simple, right? Which is to say, we say no to non-consensual sexual encounters, that there's a new enabling of women to say that there's a new intervention at the level of the law to say that and to recognize it, and there is a struggle or a debate going on about how to make consent something which is understood as at the core of any sexual activity and will be entered into the minds of the next generation of citizens from the earliest school years. Now, I should be surprised, especially given what Jude's just said, if anybody would disagree with that. But at the same time, I want to say that consent, exactly as Jude has just said also, is really much more slippery than that and much more complicated than that, because we are dealing with the sphere of human sexuality, and that is a very troubled, very complex and very difficult zone. And I want to suggest that it is in the interests of women not to smother that complexity, but to bring it to the surface and to insist that it be part of the discussion. So, for example, when I was working on writing a piece about the Me Too movement and sexual harassment, and I read Vanessa Grigoriadis' book about sexual assault on campus, some of the cases just were so difficult to get your mind around. So consent can actually be used against women, and I'll give you a couple of examples. So that if a woman texts her tutor the next day after a non-consensual sexual encounter and says, I miss you, I love you, I apologize if I hurt you, that can be used in evidence against her that therefore she had consensual sex. She can't have been raped if she does that. This is a kind of common sort of ludicrous belief that circulates in the culture, which would make nonsense of a lot of the difficulty of keeping women in women's refuges, for example, because they go back to their partners, which is to say that if you have consent just as a concept that blankets on everything, then you can't talk about the ambivalence of sexual feeling and desire. So another example was of a woman who'd written to somebody for a hookup around anal sex and then brought a charge of anal rape against him. But the evidence was used against her, because of course you can flirt online. Of course you can suggest all kinds of things online. It doesn't mean that when you're in the room with someone, you are consenting, even to the very thing that you were willing to entertain as a fantasy between you and as a form of play. And then as Helena Kennedy, who some of you will have heard earlier today, has said over and over again, there's another situation in which consent is impossible to measure, which is if a woman does not struggle during an act of rape, which will save her life, it will wreck her legal case, because there will be no signs of struggle, and bruises aren't enough, that's just seen as rough play. They've got to be torn items. There's got to be real damage to her if she's going to win her legal case. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that all muddies the water slightly, and it means that we as feminists and as women who want to make consent a central concept in our defense and our sense of what we can say yes and no to, we've got to also try and say at the same time, by the way, this can be complicated, and our relationship to the sexual act isn't always a straightforward yes or no. The second point I want to make is that there is a problem here, which can be loosely called that of sexual difference. So, in the amazing play that we just saw now, Maryland, there was a moment, I'm not going to repeat what they said, why effectively does this happen to women all the time, the killing of women? Why does it happen? I'm not going to reproduce the way they threw that at the audience. But also when I was reading about sexual harassment on campus, there was one so-called woke guy in the States, and he was describing what he'd learned in relationship to the idea of consent. He said, never buy goods if you think you're going to have to replace them. Never point a gun at somebody unless you're going to shoot. And never have sex with somebody who doesn't want it. And I thought that is so chilling, because it's as if the discourse of pay attention to what a woman actually wants had got entirely recuperated by the act of violence, guns, machines, and so on, and he had not been changed one jot. And this is what you could call the ugly undertow of sexual difference, or what also gets referred to as toxic masculinity, and just how obdurate it is. So if we're discussing consent, we've got to talk about how you get through those male psychic boundaries. I want to end by just saying that the place I go to for really understanding the complexity of this issue is often literary writing. So I want to end with an example, which is Emma McBride, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing. How many of you have read Emma McBride? I can see some people nodding. Well, those of you who've read it will know that this is a story of sexual abuse done in the first person, which is so visceral and so graphic and so disturbing and also so lyrical and so poetic. And right at the end, when she's grief-stricken about the death of her brother and she's enraged at her own history, she goes out into the woods seeking an act of sexual violence. She consents to it. She goes looking for it. But the genius of Emma McBride is to say that form of behavior is sourced in the agony she's been through as a young woman. And therefore, we've got to somehow find a place in the language of consent for really thinking about who we are and what we bring to the sexual experience and what it's meant to repair and how it can damage and how that's part of our histories. And that's the domain of psychoanalysis, which is something which I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I teach psychoanalysis and I think about it a lot. And I sort of feel we need that as well. So we need to operate on planes that might seem contradictory, absolute affirmation of freedom of assent and consent, and the complexity of the psyche and how that plays itself out in any individual sexual act. These, by the way, are arguments that have been made recently in something I've written, but also by Catherine Angel, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, and Amir Srinivasan, who I believe there's been a session on her work today at the Shameless Festival. Finally, just to say thank you so much for including me, Jude. I think what you're doing is so important, and I think this event is absolutely extraordinary.
Thank you. Thank you. So as ever, what Jacqueline does is always confronts us with having to admit that in a way we are in quite early stages of these conversations ourselves. I mean, I don't think that we as feminists, men, women feminists together, thinking about what an equal world needs to look like, what an intersectional equal world looks like, it kind of requires us not to be simplistic at all, at any level. But it's also quite difficult because, you want to, it's quicker to defend things with simplicity. And it's sort of sometimes feels nerve-wrackingly vulnerable to go into places such as your own sexual appetite, such as your changing moods, such as your yes, I did and then I didn't. And I did, it's sometimes difficult for us to plumb the conversations in a way that unravels without certainty of endpoint. But what else is there? Because we have got to be very honest about unlocking stuff, and we will eventually find out what we're talking about, I think, if we keep talking. And so, as you say, it's a slippery, difficult subject, and as women's sexual appetites have only recently been given permission, we ourselves are playing with boundaries, and we ourselves sometimes don't know exactly what we thought we wanted and then didn't, and all of that gets used against us. You know, that's definitely the case. I want to, you said to me earlier, I want to talk about obviously the South Asian community, because you said there's no understanding of consent. It's just But I mean, I feel ours is pretty if I can say ours and yours. But, you know, can you talk about that?
So, yes, ours is and the South Asian is like, because... So we're sitting here, we're having this discourse, we're all kind of feminists, we're kind of thinking along the same lines. We're saying, we can say no to sex if we change our minds, we can say no to a certain kind of behavior if we change our minds, but if you think about traditional South Asian culture, which is where I come from, there is no concept of consent. Your consent is taken for granted. You are, as a woman, you kind of stay in your father's house, then you're kind of married off, then your husband has the right to have sex with you. So nobody at any point will ask you, hey, is this what you want? Because it just does not exist as a concept. So then when we're talking, and before you think, but that's something that happens in South Asian countries, no, that happens in Britain today. Because these are value systems that we carry, that we encode. So say you're second, third generation, you've grown up here. But in your mind, this is your culture. So if you've grown up always thinking that basically I can't really say no because that option is never presented to me, how do you then say no now? You might be on a date and somebody suggests something that you don't really want to do, but your automatic encoded response is yes, because you haven't been given any other opportunity, then it's very, very difficult. So I think it's important to have conversations about consent from lots of points of view. It's complicated, I think, like Jude's just said, and it's even more complicated when you add a cultural layer. But it's important that we do, and it's important that we allow this understanding of what it means to be from a different culture, and then what consent looks like from that culture. Because otherwise, we risk not talking to a huge section of the population. So South Asian people who I represent, there might be black communities, disabled, there's different ways. So I think getting our heads around consent looks different in different spaces is really, really important.
Can I ask you to just follow up on that? Because in modern relationships where choice is available, not everything is heading for an arranged courtship, and therefore, the idea of consent is sort of circling around in what looks like a completely modern way, although we still know we don't know what we're doing. Yeah. Those triggers still go off, though, to say, I need to please, I need to obey.
Yeah.
And then when that's happened, bearing in mind that brings the shame that we're discussing all day, how is that community able to talk about that and be honest about those conflicts?
Unfortunately, the community doesn't talk about it, and I think that's the bigger problem. I don't know if you read in the news, there was a piece about a Sikh Gurdwara where 70% of the women in that Gurdwara had been abused multiple times, sometimes by people in their own kind of family. But the problem is when consent is not given culturally to women in my culture. I will say this, it just isn't. And then if something happens, you're not given the space to then stand up and say, hey, this awful thing happened to me. Because you're supposed to go along, you're supposed to kind of think about the honor of the community, because we as women are supposed to embody the honor. We carry the honor for our families, for our communities. So you can't even sit there and say that this awful thing happened to me and I feel this trauma, but what do I do with this trauma? Who do I go to? It's silenced. So it gets very, very complicated. And I think, like I was saying earlier, these are deep sort of deeply encoded, conditioned messages that we carry. And say if 5 generations of my family have done exactly the same thing, it's very difficult for me to then stand up and say no, because what is the opposite of consent? Dissent. Dissent in South Asian culture comes at a very high price. It means I'm somebody who's dissented. It means you might not have connections with family. You might not be accepted in the community. You will be making your own way entirely, and that's, very difficult sociologically. We all need to connect. We all need to feel part of the community. So it's very complicated, very, very painful oftentimes.
Mm-hmm. So tonight I'm having a conversation with somebody, Emily, who, who's written a book all about the use that she made of her body as a model and as an actress, and the assumption that people made of a beautiful body, that it was very available, and that it should be available, and that she made it available, she thought, on her own terms, but then the goalpost would be changed by others without her kind of understanding how that happened. And so we'll be talking about that this evening. But Amy, one of the things that I know that you've talked about as a disabled activist is the assumptions people will make about entitlement to the bodies of disabled women, because they feel, well, that's something I can do. I make this a choice about you based on the power you have in relationship to me. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my experience, I was born with my vision impairment, but I did not have a mobility aid until about 4 years ago. So I was invisibly disabled, and then I became visibly disabled. And I'd experienced sexual harassment as a non-disabled presenting woman. But the type of touching and harassment I experienced when I had a white cane and now a guide dog were just radically different. And actually for me, something I talk a lot about consent is that it's about the non-consensual touching that isn't necessarily sexual. And for me, I will get people dragging me across a road, pushing me into seats. I'll get people steering me around a shop. And I get my body touched all the time by people who think that they are helping. But actually, quite a lot of the time, what they're doing is very distressing, very disorientating for me. I'm pretty blind. Like, if you take me across a road, I don't want to go across and then leave me on the other side. You've actually really done me a disservice. But there's a lot of this idea that disabled people should be grateful, that we should be grateful for any interaction because, when we're not out of the house, we're just kind of lying around feeling very tragic. And, people have actually told me that I'm their good deed for the day when they've grabbed me, sometimes physically injured me. And the difficult thing is that, yes, many people, and I'll be honest, the overwhelming majority of people who do it are middle-aged women. And middle-aged women often can also turn very unpleasant when I challenge their idea of being my kind of rescuer or savior or doing me a charitable deed, because I've pointed out to them that I have boundaries that they've ignored. They didn't ask. So my hashtag, which is just ask, don't grab, it's kind of, it does what it says on the tin. I encourage members of the public, if they think a disabled person needs assistance, to ask them before they put their hands on them. And when I talk about it, people always go, of course, but I get touched every single day. And unfortunately, a lot of that touching is also sexual. And there is a problem that disabled women are seen as inherently unsexual, that we are infantilized, that we couldn't even possibly experience negative sexual experiences. And this means that we're much less likely to be believed, but also, therefore, much likely to be targeted. So disabled women experience sexual violence at twice the rate of non-disabled women. And yet, as was discussed in a news piece on Thursday, many women's services aren't really aware of this or doing anything about it. Only 1 in 10 refuges in the UK is accessible if you're a wheelchair user. So actually, our bodies are so desexualized that we're taken out of the conversation. And it's this idea of gratefulness, that I should be grateful to be manhandled and touched. And all I want people to do is to ask me, because I don't know. You know, I'm blind, and I've been told by police forces that known perpetrators specifically target disabled women. They will, especially on the transport network. So it's really about non-consensual touching. I want people to understand consent, that it's about so much more than just sexual acts. You know, when people touch, like, I would like people's hands not to be on me all day. That would be nice. And I would like to choose who touches me. Because you know what? I rely on a lot of people. I have to touch a lot of strangers because I'm blind, and I might need to hold on to someone's arm as they take me around a supermarket. But I want agency in that. I want choice in that. And I also want people to stop touching my mobility aid, which is my dog. And she's new. I've had her for a year. And the unrelenting, non-consensual touching I get now is of her. People will grab her, people will pet her, and she's my eyes. And so that feels really invasive. And it's something people experience across mobility aids, wheelchairs, crutches, people with visual difference that might have different limbs. You know, disabled people are touched, and their mobility aids are touched all the time, like we're public objects. And I really ask people to interrogate, why do you need to touch me? Why can't you answer it with the words and with, you know, communication, instead of always going for touching before I can give consent?
Thank you. I'm going to ask you like something which I even find difficult talking about, which is when men say things about, you know, go on, you're gagging for it, or I bet you never get any, or I'll give it to you because you know that will be just what you need. You know, there's a kind of a whole narrative around consent, which covers everything from disabled women, gay women, you know, women in marriages that somebody else have decided, you know, is a poor marriage, or women who are not married. You know, there's a whole kind of panoply of ideas that seem to be, you'll be grateful when you've had it from me. And that has a great kind of great brutality underneath it. And a lot of girls with learning difficulties are also sort of like being manipulated into that territory. How do you communicate back to society that is a kind of deep cynicism and deep brutality?
I think, well, you know, I'm here. I'm trying to communicate it that way. I think that I would ask everyone to examine where the disabled people are in the room. You know, where are they on TV screens? Where are they in lingerie adverts? And what consent disabled people have in their lives? Because it's so much more than just touching and sex. It's, you know, where can I live? You know, have I been told by a medical professional that I don't have capacity? And it's this idea that we should be grateful for every little crumb, you know, every, you know, a reasonable adjustment, every little gesture of access, that we're somehow waiting for this crumb of benevolence. And I think it's because disability is still framed a lot in a charitable model, where disability is seen as tragic, and disabled people are, you know, waiting for someone else's actions. We're denied agency. And actually that is, you know, it's something I experience a lot, especially as a blind woman. I get asked a lot if I know what a penis looks like. I do. They don't look that great. You know, I mean, it's a very blurry view for me, but it's not, you know, of all the things I wish I could see.
Wouldn't be your greatest loss.
Yeah.
No. Can I come to you, Tanaka? You're one of the members of the Consent Collective. And perhaps explain to everybody what the Consent Collective is and why it was created.
So, so the Consent Collective is an organisation which was started by the fantastic Dr. Nina Burrows, who lots of people kind of in the kind of anti-sexual violence world will know. She's a psychologist who's currently on tour with the Consent Collective van, having conversations about consent around, I think she's in Scotland at the moment. But really, it's about taking this conversation of consent to universities, to crisis centres, and kind of creating some joined-up conversations and approaching it with curiosity. And I think that's the thing that we really need to bring, because so much of the way we approach consent is really, like, it comes from the legal system. You know, it's almost like a lot of us have a court in our heads going, okay, well, you know, I was in this situation, something happened to me. Would this, can I judge it as consensual or not? And actually, I think it's one of the ideas that I love that has sort of come out in the work is the idea of consent as an internal process of recognition that something feels good and safe and pleasurable and comfortable and exciting, and then communicating that to the person, or, you know, people, do what you like, who you're engaged with, and whether that's sexual or whether that's something else, whether it's as simple as kind of hugging and kissing family members. And that process really, I think, because we live in such a non-consensual culture, we just need to slow down and actually, like, ask the question, like, does that feel okay here? Because it's not, consent is not something someone else can talk you into, but it's also not really something you can talk yourself into, right? You kind of, I think we mostly have an internal sense of something being okay or not okay. And we live in a culture that tries to prescribe when we should and we shouldn't consent. That's essentially asking us first to lie to ourselves, and if not, to lie to other people, or at least to validate their view of what's going on internally for us rather than actually communicate it. And so I think that's the best and biggest part of the work, is slowing that conversation down. Also having it with humor. So we have at certain points, we're not doing it at the moment, but the Consent Collective does a show called How to Be Good in Bed, which is for a student audience, which is sort of improv style kind of panel, like, you know, QI, but about sex and relationships. And kind of looking at some ways of really slowing that conversation down, approaching it with curiosity rather than judgment, and rather than kind of going to that very almost cold analytical place, which it's very useful if you're a lawyer, but it's less useful in our interpersonal relationships.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that everybody now in most countries has the beginning of language around mental health, the beginning of being able to acknowledge, you know, spectrum, neurodiversity, the different moments that we might go through in our lives that will include our mental health and vulnerability, and we're beginning to feel that we can talk about it. This is all new stuff, really. I mean, I think, you know, your idea, when you say slowing down, you mean learning at a right pace, don't you? As opposed to kind of being hurled, as obviously a lot of boys are, like, hurled into proving that they're boys, like, really early on, and then girls, like, kind of thinking, oh, I better help them. They seem to need me to help them be boys. And this is all because we haven't really talked. I was struck as well by how often we say to children, go and kiss your granddad, go and kiss your uncle, go and hug them. It's like, and I've often, you know, you're with kids who go, well, I don't want to. And you say, oh, no, come on. And you think, well, actually, we're trying to take away their permission for consent and insist that they do something which is sort of sweet, but actually it can be quite dangerous. What are you seeing as the results of the process of the Consent Collective? What's happening that's positive for you?
Lots of really fantastic conversations. I think one of the really interesting things for me particularly, and the conversations that I get to have, you know, like when we've done a show or something, the people who come up to me, is how this issue of consent spiderwebs out into lots of different areas. So a lot of the people who I talk to are from the LGBT community, and the process of thinking, well, what are our norms around consent there? You know, we're in a country where a generation or two ago, it was actually illegal for one man to consent to sex with another man, and that has an effect culturally on the tools that we use to communicate consent. It's kind of exactly what you were saying. It's that actually, you know, a lot of older men are like, saying those words feels very scary. I need to use different forms of language to negotiate consent. And that needs to be made explicit, that needs to be processed and healed through. We're kind of dealing with a huge diversity of kind of cultural backgrounds and family stuff, and it doesn't always fit kind of neatly into this idea of, I have a good sense of whether I want to have sex that I can clearly communicate, and then if the person doesn't respect that, I feel validated in calling that sexual assault and then doing something about it. So we're sort of watching people have that internal discovery, and sometimes that can be it can be the painful moment where they go, oh, that thing that happened to me was assault, and this is why. And that, that's always a hard moment to sit with for the person, and we're able to kind of do that in the moment quite a lot.
I mean, it occurred to me that one of the things that's difficult about admitting that you did things and you didn't really give your consent at all. You were coerced, you coerced yourself, all of these things. That's not to sort of blame, but just to admit this complexity, is you don't want to be a survivor, because you're already then labeling yourself and other people will label you. So you try to negotiate these things to get out of the trap of, okay, I was one of them. And one of the things at the Me Too movement, and I think this moment now, is that, we're asking each other to be brave enough to go, well, why would it not have been you? Why would you not have been part of this problem? Because society created a situation where women have so much less power. And so, Jacqueline, I mean, this issue, there's one thing to say, well, what feels good between people? But, one of the things that can feel good for people is to have power over them. That's a feeling that some people really like. And that's a very complicated territory as well, because it isn't as if just two people come together and they negotiate. Some people come together with an agenda, which is that they want to have power over other people.
Well, absolutely, and I'm really glad we've opened this up into so many different areas, but I was also thinking there's an amazing South African writer called Lewis Nkosi who wrote a novel called Mating Birds, which is about a man, a black man, who's on trial for his life because he slept with a white woman and she then accused him of rape. And he came to one of my seminars and we were saying, okay, which is it? Is it that across the racial apartheid barrier, these two people saw each other and wanted each other and it's about desire? Or was it an act in which power was the issue, right? He was experiencing power over her as a white woman because she had all the power and she was repeating the power of being a white woman. And we thought we'd have an hours-long discussion in the summer about this, and he just said it's both. It's both, right? It's both to do with real recognition between these two people as human beings, and it's all about replicating power structures. But I was really struck by something you said, both of you said, when you said the boy has to prove that he's a boy. And when you said that, I was thinking, that's what a boy is. A boy is someone who has to prove that he's a boy, right? And inside that is the idea that actually men know that that's very dodgy, very precarious, very shaky, and actually a complete fucking lie, right? So then they have to assert it even more. So one of the aspects of opening up this question of consensual sex and getting men to change their behavior must be the wonderful slowing down process that you described, where you just slow down and you think about who you are and what you want and what happened to you in the past and how complex that was and how painful. And it's as if we're opening up a space here for a different kind of conversation. So when you say, Jude, that the attention to mental health is new, I would want to say yes, but I'm sure a number of us read in the papers last week that they're now saying drug treatments for depression are not working. They say this every decade. So we're going to have talking therapies, and people like me get really excited, and then you read what they mean. They mean CBT. They mean cognitive behavioral therapy. They mean think positive and get yourself out of your depression and just sort it. It's the opposite of what you're doing, right? Because what you're doing is getting people to just sit and take the risk of discovering what they're feeling and who they are. And I think what we want is a world in which that's possible, and we can also just say the straightforward things like, I did not consent. That was coercion. and we need both of them at the same time. I think it's really hard to get them. So Amy, what you said about disability is so important because that is transparent. You're being touched, you're being invaded, you're being, on a daily basis, and so moving about the dog. They think they own the dog. They think they can be intimate with your dog. Whereas as you started off by saying today, that dog, well, actually, your dog hasn't done it, will get up and comfort you, right? But obviously that's a key, so it's as if they're busting their way into your intimacy. So we've got to be able to call that out and create the space that you're creating at the same time. And I don't know quite how we do that.
One is the groundwork for the other, right? Like if we have a strong sense of our own kind of internal consent for our own needs as individuals, then I think it gives us a really good baseline of kind of like understanding how we can meet on a more equal basis and kind of go, okay, I'm confident that I can say what I want, you're confident that you can say what you want. And we can recognize it really clearly when there are people who are pushing and transgressing, because we don't get stuck in that moment of, like I remember a moment where I was being assaulted, where I was trying to talk myself into consenting as it was happening, and trying to go, okay, well, if I just pretend that this is fine, then I won't have to be a survivor afterwards.
Yeah, exactly.
And if we can actually, and I couldn't do it because I was fortunate to have had some really good conversations about consent beforehand, and that really enabled me to go, that's rubbish. That's rubbish, dude. Like, you don't want this to be happening to you, and this is what it is. This is what is happening. And I'm so glad I had that support beforehand.
So just to you, and then I'm going to come to questions in a minute, so perhaps you can be thinking what it is you'd like to ask.
I just wanted to add something, I think, after what Tanaka said, and Jude, what you said. Sometimes these things are so internalized that we don't even know we're doing it. So I grew up in Mumbai. I did a short talk on the Hope Box earlier about being groped as a child, and that wasn't just one incident. In Mumbai, the 80s when I grew up, every single day you left your house, somebody felt you up. Somebody grabbed your breast, somebody grabbed your bottom. It was just normal. And we normalized it so much that as women and girls, we'd carry large handbags. So every time you stepped out of your house, you had this massive handbag in front of you, so they couldn't reach for you. And we thought that was normal, because you got told, like, oh, that's just how it is. And I think my point is just for us to constantly investigate the things that we consider normal. Bollywood is the other thing. I mean, not that every South Asian person needs to be into Bollywood. A lot of people aren't. But the narrative is men will chase women. Women will say no, because that's what women do. Men keep chasing women, and that's consent. So, it's just really messed up. So all my ideas of consent when I was growing up, completely messed up.
No, I remember when I was 5 dreaming that William Tell was going to sort of take me on the back of a sheep for some reason. Anyway, up to some mountain where he'd be kind of looking after me. So I think even at 5, I had this idea that you'd be captured by a man and sort of smuggled somewhere, but then he'd look after you. It's very creepy. No wonder I've turned into such a weird person.
Could I just add, Jude?
Yeah.
I think it's really important what Tanaka was saying about education. And I think that education is at multiple levels. I think that internal work, like we said, but as a society, we need to be building in education about consent. And I know it is now the law, but we have a cultural and social responsibility to do it in our communities, in our homes, in our workplaces, going back to these spaces after today and thinking about those opportunities to have those conversations and remembering that, again, consent, it's beyond a binary. We need consent education that is for everyone so that they can recognize and understand their bodies, who they want to touch, who they want touching them, what that means when you have different experiences, when you're marginalized, and keep inviting those voices into that conversation to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to understand consent, regardless of whether they're a heterosexual male or heterosexual female. And I think that is so important that we keep that diversity of experience in these conversations.
Thank you, Amy. let's take some questions, please. Who's got the microphone? Yes, could you? I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at the same time and then come back.
Yeah. So I went to school a long time ago, but I remember when we did sex education.
Sorry, I can't quite hear. Say it again.
Oh, sorry. So I went to school a long time ago, obviously. But when we did like sex education, so we're separated like men and women, or boys and girls. And pretty much for us girls, it was taught as like, oh, men or boys always want to have sex, you know, you kind of have to resist. And it was taught in a way that almost kind of implied it was never going to be pleasurable. So with things like consent, it was like, oh, I don't really like this, but, you know, I'm going to go along with it so I can have a boyfriend or, you know, keep a boyfriend or whatever. I don't know if it's changed now, but yeah.
But you're not very old. I mean, how old are you?
I'm 35, so
it's
not that long ago, yeah.
No, it's not. So sex education for you was sex
pretty
is very
much
nice.
like put up
boys
with
want
it in a way, yeah.
So you're almost primed to not enjoy it.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Behind, is anybody at the back, first of all? Okay, yes, Kate.
It's just I want to speak to this complicated narrative because I think we have such importance both in the media to start looking at complicating the narrative. We're so binary in putting simplicity out there. So I just want to return to you, Jacqueline, in presenting how complex it is for people to understand a woman's decision to go towards something that love and harm are very confusing. And I don't think we really have the discussion about love and harm. So for myself, survivor of domestic violence, when looking at love and harm, it's so complicated, and this is why women, it's a real battle, and it's so complicated. So I just think my question to that is, when are we really going to start being able to it be palatable to have the complicated narrative? Because a lot of people don't find it palatable. And shame, I think, at the end of the day, is not explicit in our society still. It's implicit, we don't talk about it, and we don't have the language to talk about it. And I think it's the language that's key for us to liberate, talking explicitly about shame.
Shall I respond?
Yeah.
You're entering the realm of the demons, right? Let's say you're entering the realm of nightmares and dreams and fantasies and wishes of which we're ashamed, but which psychoanalysts would say you can have the most terrible fantasies and unconscious wishes. It doesn't mean you want the thing to happen. Because one of the worst arguments is that the little girl wanted the daddy to have sex with her, that she had been trying to seduce him. And I remember a psychoanalyst saying once, all the more reason for him not to do it. Because between the unconscious wish or the playfulness or the seductiveness and actually wanting something to happen, there's a world. In fact, we have fantasies about things because we don't want them to happen. We want to imagine them happening. So if you want to enter that domain, and I agree with you, it's crucial, it follows on from what Tanaka said, which is if you open up the conversation, you're going to have revelatory moments like the ones you've described, where you realize something you tried to make consensual in your head actually wasn't, and that's clear. You're going to have what Amy's been saying, which is so important. Can we please just educate people on why it is not all right to touch you? Okay, these are fundamental forms of education. But if we also want to have the conversation you're pointing to, the question is really, can you get them on the same page? Or can you do both? And I think that's a real challenge for us at the moment. Because I'll just say this, I do think that one of the wonderful things about feminism is it talks about sexuality. It actually thinks that really is a political issue. And therefore, feminism is primed to bring to the surface of the culture everything that's most difficult about what we are as human sexual beings, love and harm, exactly as you're saying. So I want feminism to be militant and active and demanding and proactive, and I want it to introduce these nuances. And it's really hard to do both. So yeah, that's a great question.
Hands, if you want to say something, could you put your hand right up in the air? There's somebody waving, not drowning, back there. And you've got pink hair as well, so that makes it doubly possible to see you. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm actually the instigator of a thing I call the International Day of Consent. And if anyone's interested in when that is, it's on Tuesday, the 30th of November. hashtag I do consent. And the reason that it's hashtag I do consent, International Day of I do, is because I see consent as a doing word and a lifelong practice. And I see it as something that we give ourselves, that we give each other, and that happens at a cultural, socio-cultural level as well, and the interplay of those things. And fundamentally, what I'm not hearing from the panel at the moment is that I also see consent as something that's all over our lives and not just about sex. And whenever we make consent just about sex, we're not having a really meaningful conversation about how we reach agreement, how we give each other permission or ourselves permission to act, to use our agency, to be active citizens and to change our world. And I think consent is a really transformative doing word. So I just wanted to sort of ask the panel about breaking out of sex as consent and exploring consent more broadly.
I mean,
Okay, that's great. Amy?
If I can, I mean, I did start my section saying consent isn't just about sex. You know, it is about non-consensual touching is a really important phrase because that broadens it out into, you know, any kind of physical touching, but also it's about things like touching people's hair or deciding things on behalf of people. And I think that's particularly relevant for the disability community who have things decided on behalf of us all the time without our consent being asked. You know, people decide whether or not I can sit somewhere or decide where I can go to the toilet or decide if I'm allowed to drink in a pub or decide if I'm allowed to work. So actually, yeah, I agree, consent, and if anything, if we can get more of that, if we can have more of those conversations about why you need to leave people's hair alone and why people need to be active agents in their own lives and have the empowerment and information to make informed choices about anything from whether or not they're a vegan to what clothes they wear and what nightclub they want to go to. If we can get more of that in society, then actually I think those nuances are going to look after themselves. Because if all of us take from this session just that idea that, you know what, I need to ask people's consent for a lot more in life, I think the sex might start to look after itself a bit.
You...
100% agree. I kind of want to take it even further and suggest that if we want a truly consensual culture, we really need to start looking at a lot of our public institutions.
Yep.
And for me, I think that 100% starts with consent in schools and consent in education. Because if you think about it, we all, regardless of gender, we all start our lives engaging with a fundamentally non-consensual system. Like I remember being at school and having a bad leg and not wanting to do PE. There was no, your body is in pain, so you get to sit this out. It was, you have to do PE. And at my school, there was a dog that chased the slowest boys when we were running cross country. So it was a pretty difficult situation.
Ava promises not to do that.
Thank you. Her presence is not too triggering for me. But you know, I think that's the groundwork, that's the baseline that we're starting from. And it's sort of, I think it's actually slightly ludicrous that we then expect 15, 16, 17-year-olds to start having sex and do consent really well when we've set ourselves up so badly through the way we approach young people's bodies, through our public institutions, and through a lack of resource and through having an education system that was built by the Victorians, frankly, to build better factory workers. We're really not set up to be good at consent as a skill, as a process, as a practice.
But, I mean, since we have to bring this session to an end, I just want to come back to what you said about culture. There are many, many cultures, speaking as a, third-generation Irish. The idea of obedience in relationship to power can't be outside this conversation either, because, you know, there's consent between two people who haven't worked out how to talk about it very easily, you know, and then there's giving consent because you're in jeopardy in all kinds of tiny to large ways if you don't. And the kind of loneliness of trying to fight frameworks where you're told you have less power and therefore your job is to agree. I think that is very, very difficult to battle unless people out it and are prepared to face up to it. You know, is that, what would you say to that?
Yeah, and I think to empathize with other people as well, where coming from kind of the background I come from, it is so hard. It is so much easier to go along, even if it's painful, even if it's awful to you personally. But the pressures are so huge sometimes. And I think as human beings, if we all kind of support each other in that journey, whatever that individual journey might look like, I think it's a little bit easier for each of us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I just was thinking the other day about the fact that China has gone from a one-child policy to a actually have as many children as you like policy, and what that's going to do for women in regard to consent within marriage, you know, from the in-laws, from the political state. I mean, I could name many, many versions of what consent feels like when you've got pressures on you, not just to have sex in the kind of, you know, is this rape or not, but like, do I actually want this kind of sex for this sort of reason? And what choice do I get? So, you know, you've got state consent or removal of consent as well. So there's lots of layers to this, but I think the main thing that you've all said is unless we talk about it a lot so that we get better language, better understanding, more nuance, and a lot of honesty, then, you know, we don't know how to navigate it. And as Jacqueline says, it's just not easy. But, you know, let's keep talking. That's the whole point. Let's get beyond shame and go, actually, it's quite exciting to talk about it. And you learn a lot, don't you? So can we thank very much our panel for doing this?